The air on the Vance plantation was always thick with heat and hardship. But on this morning in 1839, it was also filled with a chilling mystery. Heavy chains, the very symbol of bondage, hung not on a man but from the branches of the great oak tree. They swayed in the breeze like a ghostly pendulum, counting the seconds since Tobias Green, the man who worked beneath them every day, had vanished into thin air. He didn't know his disappearance would become a legend whispered in the dark for 100 years. He didn't know the chains he left behind would become a warning, a promise, and a question that would never be answered. But as the sun rose higher on that fateful day, one thing was certain: nothing on this Georgia plantation would ever be the same. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The sun beat down on the Vance plantation with a relentless, suffocating force, the kind of heat that seemed to press the very air from a man's lungs. It was a sweltering afternoon a week before the disappearance, and under the sprawling branches of the ancient oak, Tobias Green worked. The tree was more than just a plant. It was a silent witness, its gnarled limbs and thick trunk having stood sentinel over generations of suffering. Its leaves, a deep and weary green, offered the only meaningful shade in the vast, sun-scorched expanse of the tool-mending area. Tobias sat on a low stool, a heavy file in his hand, drawing it with rhythmic precision across the dulled edge of a hoe. His hands, powerful and broad, were a road map of his life, etched with the scars of burns from the forge and calloused from years of gripping hammers and tongs. Yet for all their roughness, they moved with a surgeon's care, each stroke of the file deliberate and exact. He was a quiet man, his face a mask of stoicism that betrayed nothing of the restless, churning thoughts within. His eyes, deep-set and observant, missed little. He saw the way the other enslaved people moved, the slight dip of a head, the quick shared glance that conveyed a volume of unspoken understanding. They passed him on their way to and from the fields, their interactions with him brief, a muttered greeting or a simple nod, but always freighted with a shared burden. The air around the oak was thick with the smell of hot metal, dry dust, and the faint sweet scent of the magnolias that bloomed near the master's house, a fragrance that felt like a cruel mockery in a place so devoid of beauty. From the shaded veranda of the big house, Elias Vance watched the distant figures in his fields, a mint julep sweating in his hand. He was a man for whom the world was a ledger, every soul on his property an entry in a column of assets or liabilities. He swirled the ice in his glass, the clinking sound sharp in the humid air. His overseer, Mr. Croft, stood beside him, a coarse, bull-necked man whose presence seemed to radiate a low-frequency brutality. Croft's focus was never on profit margins, but on the mechanics of control. The price of cotton is holding steady, but the cost of new equipment from the north keeps climbing. Vance mused, his voice detached. We'll need every hand working at peak efficiency for the harvest. Croft grunted, his gaze fixed on the figure of Tobias under the oak. He knows his place. They all do. A little pressure keeps the gears turning. The blacksmith is a valuable asset, Croft. See that he is not overworked before the harvest. Croft's lips curled into a semblance of a smile. He's strong. He can take it. A good tool needs to be used, not kept on a shelf. Vance took a slow sip of his drink, the conversation already forgotten, his mind drifting back to columns of numbers, to profit and loss, oblivious to the human gears turning under the oppressive Georgia sun. Later that day, the pressure Croft spoke of was applied. A young field hand, barely a man, had stumbled, dropping a bundle of cut sugar cane. It was a minor thing, an accident born of exhaustion and the dizzying heat. But for Mr. Croft, it was an infraction, a disruption to the relentless rhythm of the plantation. He dragged the boy to the open space near the great oak, the place where examples were made, Tobias, who had just finished sharpening the last of the hoes, was forced to watch. He stood by the anvil, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle of a heavy hammer. Croft's voice was a low snarl as he berated the boy, his words lashing out before the whip itself. The leather cracked against the boy's back, a sound that seemed to make the very air flinch. Once, twice, 3 times. The boy cried out, a thin, desperate sound that was swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky. Tobias's jaw was a knot of granite. He did not look away. He watched every stripe materialize, every shudder that racked the young man's body. His gaze was fixed, burning, absorbing the brutality until it became a part of him. When it was over, Croft shoved the boy to the ground. "Let that be a lesson to all of you," he spat, his eyes sweeping over the other workers who had frozen in their tasks. As the boy struggled to his feet, his eyes, filled with tears and shame, met Tobias's. It was a fleeting connection, a spark in the suffocating darkness. In that shared glance, Tobias conveyed not pity but a shared pain, a deep and resonant anger. And in the flicker of that moment, something harder ignited within him. Something cold and sharp and resolute. The catalyst had been struck. A plan long dormant in the restless corners of his mind began to take shape. Dusk settled over the plantation, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The oppressive heat of the day finally began to recede, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the low hum of the evening. Tobias walked the well-worn path to his cabin, a small windowless structure of rough-hewn logs. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the meager meals Sarah, his wife, was preparing. She stood over the hearth, her silhouette a study in quiet strength against the flickering firelight. Her face, usually a mask of weary resilience, was etched with a constant underlying fear for the safety of her family. Their young son Jacob slept soundly on a thin pallet in the corner, his small chest rising and falling in the innocent rhythm of childhood. The cabin was a sanctuary of sorts, a small pocket of tenderness in a world of unrelenting hardship. Sarah turned as Tobias entered, her eyes immediately finding the new bruise darkening his arm, a faint mark left when he had braced himself against the forge during the punishment. "The work was hard today," she said, her voice soft, her touch on his arm a gentle question. Tobias looked from her face to his sleeping son, a profound weariness in his eyes. "The work is always hard," he replied, his voice a low rumble. He sat down at the small, rickety table as Sarah served the ash cake and water. They ate in a comfortable silence, the air thick with all the things they could not say. There was no overt discussion of escape, no whispered plans of running north. The words were too dangerous, the hope too fragile to be spoken aloud. But the thought of it was a constant presence, a ghost that sat at the table with them, a silent prayer in the space between their heartbeats. Tobias looked at Jacob, so small, so vulnerable, and a fierce, protective love surged through him, hardening his resolve. "But a man must find his own shade," he finished, his voice barely a whisper, a promise to himself as much as to her. Later, when the plantation was cloaked in the deep, starless dark of a new moon, Tobias slipped out of his cabin. The world was asleep. The master's house was a dark monolith, the overseer's cottage silent. Even the night birds seemed to hold their breath. He moved with a practiced stealth, his bare feet making no sound on the cool, damp earth. He made his way to the forge, the heart of his waking life, the place of his labor. But tonight, his work was his own. He stoked the embers in the forge, coaxing them back to life. The soft glow illuminated his face, casting his features in a grim, determined light. He worked with a focused intensity. His movements economical and precise. He was not repairing tools. He was not mending a broken plowshare or shaping a new hinge for the barn door. He was creating. From a length of heavy iron rod he had secreted away weeks ago, he began to forge a chain. The rhythmic clang of the hammer on the anvil was a sound of pure defiance, a heartbeat of rebellion in the dead of night. Each strike was a blow against his bondage, each spark that flew from the hot metal a rebellious thought given form. He worked meticulously, linking one heavy, perfectly formed oval to the next. The chain grew under his powerful hands, a precise and horrifying replica of the ones used for punishment, the ones that hung in the overseer's shed, the ones that had scarred the back of the boy that afternoon. The sound of his hammer was a secret language, a declaration of intent. It was the sound of a man forging not just his own chains, but his own legend. He worked until the first hint of dawn threatened the eastern sky, his face slick with sweat, his muscles aching. But his purpose as clear and as hard as the iron cooling in the quenching tub. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a fragile pearly gray that did little to cut through the thick, humid air. It was a young field hand, the same boy whose back still burned with the memory of Croft's whip, who saw it first. He was on his way to the well, his shoulders slumped with the familiar weight of the day to come, when a sound made him pause. It was a faint metallic clinking, a rhythmic ghostly chime that was utterly alien to the usual morning chorus of roosters and waking murmurs. He looked toward the sound's origin, toward the great oak, and froze. His wooden bucket slipped from his grasp, hitting the packed earth with a dull thud. There, hanging from the thickest, lowest branch, the very branch that had shaded Tobias for countless hours, was a heavy iron chain. It swayed gently in the morning breeze, a pendulum marking time in a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. The space beneath it, where Tobias's stool and tools should have been, was empty. Word spread not like fire, but like smoke, a silent, choking cloud of whispers that billowed through the slave quarters and out toward the fields. It was a shared, unspoken signal. Work slowed, heads turned, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a terrifying, nascent awe, kept glancing toward the oak. The clinking of the chain was the only sound that seemed to matter, a sound that cut through the morning haze and settled deep in the marrow of their bones. It was a question and a statement all at once. A sight so impossible, so audacious that it defied immediate comprehension. The sun climbed higher, turning the gray sky to a blazing blue, and the chain glinted, each link a spark of cold, hard light. Mr. Croft arrived like a thunderclap. He strode toward the oak, his face a mask of confusion that quickly curdled into a florid, explosive rage. He saw the chain not as a mystery, but as a personal affront, a direct and insolent mockery of his authority. The very instrument of his control, of the order he imposed with leather and iron, was now hanging in effigy, turned into a spectacle by the very man he considered little more than a useful tool. His thick neck reddened, and a vein pulsed at his temple. He saw the small crowd of enslaved people frozen in their tracks, their eyes fixed on the impossible sight, and his fury boiled over. "Get back to work," he bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. "All of you! This is his devilment, and I'll see him whipped for it. Find him. I want him found by noon." He jabbed a finger at two nearby men, their faces pale with fear. "You and you, get up there. Cut that thing down now." The men hesitated, their eyes darting from Croft's furious face to the ominous chain and back again. The idea of climbing the ancient tree, of touching that chain, felt like a trespass on something sacred and dangerous. Croft took a menacing step forward. "Did you hear me? Now!" Scrambling, one of the men boosted the other into the lower branches. He climbed awkwardly, his hands shaking as he pulled out a small hatchet. The metallic clang as he struck the chain echoed across the unnaturally quiet plantation, each blow a punctuation mark in the unfolding drama. Finally, the chain broke and fell to the ground with a heavy final crash. It lay coiled in the dust like a dead snake, but its image was already burned into the mind of everyone who had seen it hanging. Croft, his face still a thunderous mask, stormed away from the tree, his boots kicking up clouds of red dust. His destination was singular, his purpose absolute. He marched directly to the small, rough-hewn cabin where Tobias lived with his family. He kicked the flimsy door open, the wood groaning in protest as it slammed against the interior wall. Sarah was inside, clutching Jacob to her chest. She had heard the shouting, had seen the commotion from the crack in her door, and a cold, paralyzing dread had taken root in her stomach. She stood now, a pillar of terrified dignity, her body a shield for her son. Croft's presence filled the tiny space, his rage sucking the very air from the room. "Where is he?" he snarled, his eyes scanning the cabin as if expecting to find Tobias hiding under the single cot. He tore the thin blanket from the pallet, throwing it to the floor. He kicked over the small table, sending the tin cups and plates scattering. "Where did he go, woman? Did he speak of the North? Did he have help?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She genuinely knew nothing of a plan, nothing of a destination. All she knew was the deep, hollow ache of his absence, the cold space in the bed beside her when she woke. But she also knew that any sign of weakness, any hint of knowledge would be a weapon in Croft's hands. She held Jacob tighter. The boy's small face buried in her dress and met the overseer's glare. Her voice, when it came, trembled, but it did not break. "He spoke of his work," she said, her words clear and deliberate. "He spoke of his son. He is my husband. That is all I know." Croft's face contorted. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her, but she did not flinch. For a long moment he stared at her, searching for the lie, for the flicker of deception in her eyes. He found only a deep, unyielding terror, and beneath it a strength he could not comprehend. With a final, frustrated roar, he swept his arm across the mantel, sending the few meager possessions, a carved wooden bird, a smooth river stone, crashing to the floor. He stormed out, leaving Sarah shaking in the wreckage of her home, the silence broken only by her son's frightened sobs. The search party was a brutal farce. It was not an organized attempt to find a missing man, but an exercise in intimidation, a loud and violent reassertion of control. Croft gathered a handful of other white men from the plantation and neighboring farms, men who shared his view of the world, and they set off on horseback. They were a chaotic and undisciplined mob, fueled by whiskey and righteous indignation. Their shouts echoed through the cypress swamps and pine forests that bordered the Vance property. Their dogs, a mix of hounds and curs, barked and bayed, their noise a violent intrusion into the quiet wilderness. They crashed through the undergrowth, trampling delicate ferns and startling birds from their nests, their horses' hooves churning the soft earth into mud. It was a search designed to be seen and heard, a performance of power for the benefit of those left behind on the plantation. The narration of their progress was one of brute force, a clumsy, angry smashing against the landscape. It stood in stark contrast to the image that was already forming in the minds of the enslaved, the image of Tobias moving through these same woods. They pictured him moving not with noise but with silence. They imagined his bare feet finding purchase on moss and stone, his body slipping between the trees like a shadow, his senses alive to the language of the forest. While Croft's men shouted and cursed, they imagined Tobias listening to the snap of a twig, the call of a bird, becoming a part of the wilderness. Not an invader. The searchers found nothing. Not a footprint, not a broken branch, not a single sign that a man had passed that way. By late afternoon they returned, their horses lathered, their faces flushed with frustration and drink. They had succeeded only in terrorizing the landscape, their violence yielding nothing but an echoing silence. That evening, as a deep, velvety darkness settled over the slave quarters, a small group gathered in the shadows behind Old Man Josiah's cabin. The air was still thick with unspoken questions, with the lingering shock of the day's events. Josiah, an elder whose eyes held the memory of generations, sat on a stool, his gnarled hands resting on his knees. He had seen more than any man present, had witnessed births and deaths, sorrows and the fleeting, desperate joys that flickered in the darkness of their lives. He looked toward the great oak, now just a massive silhouette against the star-dusted sky, its branches bare and accusing. He had been quiet all day, watching, listening, letting the story settle in his mind. Now he was ready to give it a voice. His own voice, when he spoke, was a low, resonant hum, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "That tree has seen 1,000 sorrows," he began, his gaze fixed on the distant oak. "It has seen the whip, and it has seen the rope. Its roots drink from soil that holds the tears of our mothers and the blood of our fathers." The small group leaned in, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of a single lantern. "Tobias, he knew that," Josiah continued, his voice gaining a quiet power. "He knew that tree was a witness. He didn't just run from the chains, you see, that ain't the whole of it. He turned them back on this place. He took the very thing they used to bind us, and he hung it in the sky for all to see." A murmur of understanding went through the group. Josiah's words were shaping their raw fear and confusion into something new, something with meaning. "He left a warning," the old man concluded, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a sound that carried more weight than any shout. "A warning for any who pass under those branches. A warning that a man's spirit can't be held, even if his body is." In the quiet that followed, the empty space beneath the oak tree no longer felt like a simple absence. It felt like a presence. The legend of Tobias Green, the man who vanished and left his chains behind, had taken its first breath. Weeks bled into a month, and the raw, gaping wound of Tobias's disappearance began to scar over, forming the strange and varied tissue of legend. The official search, if Croft's violent rampage could be called such, was long over. On the Vance plantation, a tense and watchful silence had replaced the initial shock, but beyond its borders the story had sprouted legs and was beginning to run. In the nearby town, where farmers and merchants gathered to trade goods and gossip, the tale was a source of morbid curiosity. The Saturday market buzzed with the drone of flies and the murmur of commerce, the air thick with the smell of livestock, dust, and fried dough. Two farmers, their faces weathered by the sun, leaned against a wagon wheel, discussing the price of seed before their conversation inevitably drifted to the strange events on the Vance property. "Heard Elias Vance lost one of his blacksmiths," the first farmer, a practical man named Jeb, said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Just up and ran off. Costly, I'd wager. A good smith is hard to come by." The second farmer, a younger man with wider, more superstitious eyes, shook his head slowly. "That ain't the half of it, Jeb. My wife's cousin, she does sewing for Mrs. Vance sometimes. She says it wasn't just a runaway." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping. "They say they found chains. Heavy ones hanging right from that big old oak tree in the middle of the yard. Just hanging there empty, like some kind of voodoo curse." Jeb scoffed, though he couldn't quite hide the flicker of interest in his eyes. "Voodoo? That's slave nonsense. The man ran, that's all. Probably got caught in a swamp and eaten by gators. Vance will lose a bit of money, that's all." "I don't know," the younger man insisted, his gaze distant. "She said the place has a bad feel to it now. Said the other slaves won't hardly go near that tree, not even in broad daylight. They whisper about it. They say Tobias didn't run from the chains, he left them as a sign, a curse on the whole place." The story was already morphing, twisting in the mouths of the white community from an act of defiance into a dark and primitive ghost story, a piece of local folklore to be whispered with a delicious shiver of fear. But the story had another life, a more powerful one, that grew along the hidden waterways and secret paths of the enslaved community. It traveled from plantation to plantation, carried by a field hand sent on an errand, a cook visiting her sister, a preacher traveling his circuit. One evening, under the cloak of a moonless sky, a group gathered by the slow-moving Flint River for a baptism. It was a dangerous assembly, a sacred ritual practiced in defiance of masters who feared any form of independent gathering. The air was cool and damp, smelling of wet earth and night-blooming jasmine. The only light came from a few shielded lanterns, casting a soft, holy glow on the faces gathered at the water's edge. After the last soul had been brought up from the water, shivering and renewed, they gathered closer. An old man from a neighboring plantation, his voice raspy with age, began to tell the story. It was old man Josiah's version passed to him through a chain of whispers, and it had already gained power and detail in the telling. They say the overseer, he found the chains and his rage was a storm, the old man recounted, his voice resonating in the quiet night. He had them cut down, but you cannot cut down a sign from God. A chorus of low amens rippled through the crowd. Tobias, he was a man of iron and spirit. He walked through the fire of the forge and was not burned. He took their chains, the very symbol of our sorrow, and he offered them up to the heavens. He made that tree, a place of pain, into a holy place. For them, the oak was no longer a place of punishment, but a shrine. Tobias was no mere runaway. He was a figure of mythic power, a man who had wrestled with the devil of bondage and vanished, leaving a promise in his place. The story was not a curse, but a sermon. It was a testament that a man could be so filled with the spirit of freedom that he could dissolve into thin air, leaving only the instruments of his oppression behind as a monument to his victory. This spiritual fervor did not reach the cold, formal dining room of the Vance house. There the story was a source of irritation and embarrassment. Elias Vance sat at the head of his long polished table, the silver clinking against the fine china with a sharp, brittle sound. His wife, a pale, nervous woman, picked at her food. "The servants are spooked, Elias," she said, her voice thin. "They talk in whispers. There's a feeling in the air. It's most unsettling." Vance slammed his fork down, the sound making his wife jump. "It's a financial loss is what it is. A valuable piece of property has vanished, and now my entire operation is disrupted by this superstitious nonsense. I was at the market today and I heard men talking. Not about the loss, but about curses and hauntings. It makes the plantation seem poorly managed, unstable. It reflects badly on me." His concerns were not for his wife's peace of mind or the morale of his workforce, but for his reputation among his peers, for the neat and orderly columns of his mental ledger. He turned his cold gaze on Mr. Croft, who stood by the sideboard waiting to be dismissed. "Croft, this has gone on long enough. I want this foolishness to stop. I don't care what you have to do. Punish anyone caught spreading these tales. I want the name Tobias forgotten on this plantation by the end of the week. Is that understood?" Croft, his own authority already feeling the sting of the pervasive legend, nodded sharply. "Yes, sir. I'll put an end to it." But the story had a life of its own, and it couldn't be so easily killed. For Sarah, it was not a legend or a ghost story. It was a constant living presence, an ache in the very center of her being. She performed her daily routines with a mechanical precision, her body moving through the familiar rhythms of washing, mending, and cooking, but her mind was elsewhere. Her eyes in their unguarded moments would drift to the great oak, a silent, constant vigil. She scanned its branches, its trunk, the ground beneath it, for what she did not know. A sign, a message, some impossible token that he was safe, that he was thinking of her. The public story being woven in the quarters gave her a strange, distant comfort, but it was too large, too mythic. She needed something small, something personal. One afternoon, as she swept the packed earth in front of her cabin, her gaze fell upon a small object near the base of the oak tree, half hidden by a tuft of grass. It was a stone, no bigger than her thumb, but its shape was peculiar, a smooth, dark gray rock with a perfect white ring encircling it. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen this stone before. Tobias had a small, secret collection of such things, unusually shaped rocks and bits of colored glass he found over the years. He kept them in a little cloth bag hidden in the wall of their cabin. He had called them his earth treasures. He would show them to Jacob sometimes, telling the boy that even in the hardest ground, you could find something beautiful if you looked close enough. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she darted forward, snatching the stone from the ground. It was cool and smooth in her palm, the white ring a perfect, unbroken circle. She clutched it tightly, the hard reality of it a shock to her system. How did it get here? Had he left it for her? Was it a message, a sign placed there on that last fateful night, a promise that their family circle, like the ring on the stone, remained unbroken? Or was she just seeing what she desperately wanted to see? Was it a coincidence? A random stone kicked up by a passing cart? Her grief-tormented mind imbuing it with a meaning it did not possess? She didn't know. But as she slipped the stone into her pocket, its weight a solid, tangible presence against her leg, it became her first true piece of hope. It was a secret she held close. A personal relic of the man she loved, separate from the grand, growing legend of the man who had vanished. Mr. Croft, armed with Vance's orders, set about his task with a grim fury. He was a man who understood only brute force, and he applied it with a heavy hand. Any two people caught whispering together were separated with a sharp word and a threatening glare. A man humming a hymn that mentioned freedom, or Canaan, was given extra back-breaking labor. He made an example of a young woman who was overheard telling the story of the chains to a child, tying her to a post and threatening the whip, though he stopped short of using it, knowing that another act of public brutality near the oak would only feed the very legend he was trying to starve. But his efforts were futile. The story did not die, it simply went deeper underground, into the silent language of shared glances, into the coded words of spirituals, into the stories told to children in the dead of night. His frustration grew, curdling into a volatile paranoia. He began to see defiance in every shadow, insolence in every averted gaze. The rustling leaves of the great oak seemed to whisper Tobias's name. The rhythmic clang of the new blacksmith's hammer sounded like a mockery of his failure to find the old one. His authority, once absolute and unquestioned, now felt hollow, undermined by a ghost he could not catch, a story he could not kill. He began to drink more heavily, his temper becoming even more erratic and unpredictable. The atmosphere on the plantation, already tense, grew thick with a new kind of fear. The fear of a desperate man losing control. The great oak tree, once the stage for his most brutal assertions of power, became a place he avoided. Its shadow seemed to mock him, a constant silent reminder of the man who had slipped through his fingers and in doing so had dealt a mortal blow to his pride. The seasons began to turn, the brutal summer heat giving way to the slightly less oppressive warmth of a Georgia autumn. The story of Tobias, however, remained fixed in the humid air of the Vance plantation, a permanent feature of the landscape. It was during this time that a new sound joined the familiar plantation rhythms. The rattle and creak of a merchant's wagon. A traveling purveyor of goods, a man named Silas, made his rounds every few months, bringing bolts of cloth, metal trinkets, sacks of coffee, and most importantly, news from the world beyond the suffocating confines of the county. He was a talkative man, his loneliness on the road making him a fountain of stories and rumors. He sat on the veranda with Elias Vance, sharing a glass of whiskey while a house slave named Elspeth moved silently in the background, refilling their glasses. Vance, still sore about his financial ledger being unbalanced, complained about the loss of his blacksmith. A prime hand, strong and skilled, vanished without a trace, left me in a real bind right before the harvest, he grumbled. Silas the merchant swirled his whiskey, his eyes lighting up with the pleasure of having a relevant tale. Vanished, you say? A blacksmith? That's a strange coincidence. He leaned forward conspiratorially. I was up in the Piedmont of South Carolina, maybe 100 miles north of here, just a few weeks back. The talk in one town was about a runaway they'd seen. A big man, they said, with watchful eyes that didn't miss a thing. A blacksmith by trade and a master at it from the look of his hands. Vance sat up straighter, his interest piqued. Did they catch him? Well, that's the thing, Silas said with a dramatic pause. He wasn't alone. He was traveling with a Quaker, a known abolitionist man named Seth Macy. Macy's got a reputation for helping runaways. They were heading north, moving fast and quiet. The local sheriff put a posse together, but they were gone. Disappeared as if the road just swallowed them up. In the background, Elspeth's hand did not tremble as she poured the whiskey. Her face remained a perfect placid mask of servitude. But her ears burned, and her heart began a frantic silent drumbeat against her ribs. She had heard. She took the empty glasses and retreated into the cool darkness of the house, the merchant's words echoing in her mind, a dangerous and explosive piece of news that she knew she had to carry. The news traveled through the plantation's hidden channels, a whisper network as intricate and invisible as a spider's web. It passed from Elspeth to the cook in the heat of the kitchen, from the cook to her son who worked in the stables, from the stable boy to a field hand fetching water. It moved like a current of electricity, a secret language of flickered glances and coded phrases. By evening, it reached Sarah. She was sitting outside her cabin mending a tear in Jacob's small shirt, when another woman passing by on her way from the fields paused for a moment. The woman bent down pretending to adjust the strap on her shoe and spoke to the dust, her voice a low, urgent murmur. They say a smith was seen, north, with a Quaker, moving toward the star. And then she was gone, leaving the words hanging in the air. A firestorm ignited in Sarah's heart. It was a hope so fierce and so sudden it almost buckled her knees. Tobias, free. The words were a prayer, a song, a miracle. She could see him in her mind's eye, his long legs eating up the miles, his watchful eyes fixed on the horizon, a free man walking on free soil. The joy was a physical thing, a lightness in her chest that made her want to weep and laugh all at once. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle the sound, her knuckles white. But immediately crashing in like a tidal wave behind the joy came a new and sharper terror. If the rumor was true, if he was alive and on his way, then he was also being hunted. The image of his freedom was instantly replaced by the image of his recapture. She saw him cornered, beaten, dragged back in the very chains he had so defiantly left behind. The hope that had just been born was now a source of exquisite agony. The fear of his recapture was 100 times worse than the dull, aching uncertainty of his absence. She fumbled in her pocket, her fingers closing around the smooth, cool stone with the white ring. It was no longer just a token of memory. It was a desperate talisman. A prayer she clutched in her fist, a fragile shield against the terrifying images that flooded her mind. The rumor that brought Sarah such a volatile mixture of hope and dread had a very different effect on Elias Vance. When Croft reported the merchant's story to him, Vance's irritation curdled into a white-hot rage. The idea that Tobias had not only escaped but had done so with the help of an organized abolitionist network was a profound insult. It meant the act was not random but part of a larger, insidious rebellion. It meant Tobias's defiance could become an inspiration, a dangerous spark that could ignite fires all over his and other plantations. The financial loss was now secondary to the threat to the entire system on which his world was built. He had previously considered it a waste of good money, but now, his pride wounded and his authority challenged, he would spare no expense. He would make an example of Tobias that would be remembered for a generation. He sent a rider north with a pouch of coins and a message. He was hiring a man whose name was spoken in fearful whispers in slave quarters from Georgia to Virginia, a man who specialized in recovering the most valuable and cunning of fugitives. He was hiring Finch. Finch arrived a week later. He did not ride in with the blustering fury of Croft. He appeared at dusk, a tall, lean silhouette on a wiry horse, moving with a quiet purpose that was far more menacing than any loud display. He was a man stripped of all excess, his face a collection of hard lines and sharp angles, his eyes the color of a winter sky, cold and unsettlingly patient. He was flanked by 2 dogs, not the yapping curs Croft used, but lean, silent hounds with dark coats and an air of lethal intelligence. They moved with a predatory grace, their paws making almost no sound on the dusty road. A new wave of fear, colder and deeper than any Croft could inspire, washed over the plantation. The name Finch was a legend of its own, a story of relentless pursuit and inevitable capture. His arrival meant the hunt had begun in earnest. Finch was not a man who wasted time on anger or intimidation. He was a craftsman, and his craft was the methodical deconstruction of a man's flight. He began his investigation not by questioning the enslaved, but by observing the physical world Tobias had left behind. He spent hours in the forge, his long fingers tracing the marks on the anvil, examining the tools left on the workbench, running a piece of scrap iron through his hands. He was not looking at objects. He was reading a story, trying to understand the mind and skill of the man who had worked there. He then moved to the cabin. He stood in the center of the small room, his cold eyes taking in every detail: the neatly patched walls, the worn cot, the empty space where Tobias's few possessions had been. He was looking for the subtle signs of a planned departure, a hidden compartment, a loose floorboard. Finally, he came for Sarah. He did not storm in as Croft had. He appeared at her door, a quiet shadow, and his voice when he spoke was low and devoid of emotion. "I need to ask you some questions about your husband," he said. It was not a request. Sarah sat at her small table, her hands clenched in her lap, the stone a hard knot in her fist. Finch did not sit. He paced the small space, his movements slow and deliberate, like a circling hawk. His questions were not the bludgeons Croft had used. They were surgical knives, designed to slip past her defenses and find the truth. "Your husband was a good blacksmith," Finch began, his eyes fixed on her face. "A man who understands iron, he understands patience. He understands how things fit together. This was not a man who would run into a swamp without a plan." "Who were his friends?" "He kept to himself mostly," Sarah answered, her voice a thin thread. "His work, his family, that was his life." Finch stopped pacing and picked up the small wooden bird that had been knocked to the floor during Croft's rampage. He turned it over in his hands. "He made this? The work is fine, detailed. A man who can do this kind of work is smart. He plans. He doesn't just run, he leaves a trail." He placed the bird back on the mantel and his cold eyes locked onto hers. "And I always find the trail." Sarah met his gaze, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She clung to the simple truth of her ignorance, her only shield. He is my husband, she repeated, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. I pray he is safe, but I do not know where he has gone. Finch stared at her for a long, unnerving moment, his eyes searching for the slightest crack in her composure. He saw only a woman consumed by fear and loss. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and then he was gone, leaving a chill in the air that was colder than any winter wind. The rumor of the Quaker and the talk of the North had planted a new seed in the minds of the enslaved community. It gave a name and a direction to their hopes. That night, Old Man Josiah once again gathered a small, trusted group in the deep shadows behind his cabin. The arrival of Finch had terrified them all, and they sought the old man's wisdom, his ability to frame their fear in the context of faith. "The hunter is here," one man whispered, his voice trembling. "Finch finds everyone." Josiah looked up at the sky, at the sliver of a moon and the faint trail of the Milky Way. "There are trails on the earth, and there are trails in the sky," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "Finch, he is a man of the earth. He follows footprints in the dust. He can't see the other path." He pointed a gnarled finger toward the North Star, a steady, unwavering point of light. "For generations, our people have whispered of the path to the promised land. It is not a road you can see with your eyes. Some call it the river of moonlight that flows north. Some call it the path of the drinking gourd, following that star. It is a railroad that runs underground on faith and courage." He looked at the anxious faces around him. "Finch and his dogs, they can run all over Georgia, but they cannot catch a man who has found his way to the Lord's railroad. We must not fear the hunter. We must pray that Tobias found his station. We must pray he is riding that river of moonlight all the way to freedom." His words transformed the desperate flight into a sacred pilgrimage, a journey guided by God and the stars beyond the reach of earthly hunters. The conflict was now clear, a race between Finch's cold, relentless logic and the community's fervent, desperate faith. Months bled into one another, the chill of winter settling into the bones of the land before slowly giving way to the damp, hopeful breath of spring. The hunt for Tobias Green had stretched from weeks into a season, a long, drawn-out campaign that yielded nothing but frustration. Finch, the relentless hunter, had followed the trail north, applying his cold logic to the whispers and rumors. He had tracked the abolitionist Quaker, Seth Macy, to a small town in North Carolina, only to find the man's trail had been deliberately and expertly obscured. Every lead turned into a dead end. Every potential witness offered a blank stare or a conflicting story. The trail, once hot with promise, had grown cold, then vanished completely, as if the man he was hunting had simply dissolved into the northern mist. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and soft pink, Finch rode back onto the Vance plantation. He was alone. His 2 hounds trotted at his horse's heels, their lean bodies thinner, their movements lacking the sharp, predatory eagerness they had possessed upon their arrival. Finch himself looked worn, not by physical exhaustion, but by a deeper, more profound weariness. His face was a mask of grim professionalism, but his eyes, those cold chips of winter sky, held the flat, empty look of defeat. He dismounted in front of the main house and handed the reins to a stable boy without a word. Elias Vance was waiting for him on the veranda, a glass of brandy in his hand, his posture rigid with impatience. "Well?" Vance demanded, forgoing any greeting. "Where is he? And where is my money? I paid for a result, Finch, not a tour of the countryside." Finch slowly mounted the steps, his spurs making a soft, weary jingle. He stopped before Vance, his height casting a long shadow in the fading light. "Your money is spent, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. And your man is gone. Vance's face flushed with anger. Gone? What do you mean, gone? Did you find the Quaker? Did you find the trail? I found the trail and then I lost it, Finch admitted, his voice devoid of apology. It was a simple statement of fact. Macy had help, a whole network. They passed your man from one hand to the next like a hot coal. By the time I got close, he was a ghost. Either the earth swallowed him whole or he's smarter than all of us. He paused, his gaze drifting toward the great oak tree, its new spring leaves rustling in the evening breeze. You won't get him back. Vance slammed his glass down on the railing, the brandy sloshing over the side. This is unacceptable. I paid you a fortune. You are supposed to be the best. I am the best, Finch said, his voice dropping, taking on a chilling edge. Which means no one will find him now. He turned his cold eyes back to Vance. You should be less concerned about the man and more concerned about the story he left behind. Ghosts have a way of coming back. Or maybe, he added, his words as sharp and pointed as a knife's tip, they just make other people brave enough to try the same. With that he turned, descended the steps, and walked toward the stables to retrieve his horse, leaving Elias Vance alone on the veranda, his fury mingling with a new and unsettling seed of fear. Finch's failure was a thunderclap in the spiritual world of the plantation. It was not seen as a failure of a man, but as a triumph of the spirit. If the great Finch, the boogeyman of runaways, the man whose name alone was a cage, could not find Tobias, then Tobias was truly beyond the reach of mortal men. He had not just escaped, he had ascended. The legend, already potent, now became unassailable truth. It was no longer just a story whispered in the dark. It was a foundational myth, a source of profound and resilient strength. The tale of the chains on the oak became a lullaby sung to restless children, a story of a man who flew away to the stars, leaving his earthly burdens behind. It became a sermon preached in secret, a testament to the power of faith to break any bond. And for the white families in the surrounding area, it solidified into a genuine ghost story, a warning to their children not to wander near the Vance plantation after dark, lest they see the ghost of a blacksmith swinging from the branches of the haunted oak. The story had triumphed completely, becoming more real and more powerful than the man himself. For no one was this triumph more of a torment than for Mr. Croft. The overseer, a man whose entire sense of self was built on the foundation of absolute control, found that foundation crumbling to dust. Finch's defeat was his own humiliation magnified 100-fold. He had been the first to fail, and now the ultimate authority had failed as well, validating the quiet, insolent defiance he saw in the eyes of every slave he passed. He became a man haunted not by a ghost, but by his own impotence. His paranoia grew like a choking vine. He saw plots in the silent gatherings of women mending clothes. He heard rebellion in the rhythm of the work songs from the fields. The rustling leaves of the great oak tree became a constant mocking whisper of Tobias's name. His cruelty, once a strategic tool of intimidation, became erratic and unpredictable, the lashing out of a cornered animal. He would fly into a rage over a misplaced tool or a slow response, his punishments becoming more frequent and less rational. He began to drink heavily, the smell of stale whiskey a constant cloud around him. He would spend his evenings staring out from his porch, not at the fields he commanded, but at the dark, looming silhouette of the oak tree. It had been the stage of his power, the place where his authority was made manifest in stripes and tears. Now it was a monument to his failure. He began to avoid it, taking longer routes to the fields, his gaze skittering away from it as if the sight of it was a physical blow. The tree, and the story that lived in its branches, had defeated him more completely than any physical rebellion ever could. For Sarah, the news of Finch's departure brought not joy, but a strange and profound peace. The violent, heart-stopping terror of recapture, a fear that had been a constant, sharp-edged presence in her life for months, was finally gone. The hunter had left the forest. In its place, a different emotion settled, a dull, constant ache of absence. It was a grief she knew would never leave her. The sorrow of a life partner vanished from her world. But this quiet, enduring ache was infinitely more bearable than the sharp, panic terror. It was a wound that could be lived with. She stopped looking for signs. The frantic, desperate search for messages in the placement of a stone or the call of a bird ceased. Her hope, once a volatile and dangerous fire, transformed into a steady internal warmth. It was no longer the hope of his imminent return, but the enduring hope that he was free, that he was safe, that somewhere in the vast unknown world he was breathing the air of a man who owned himself. The stone with the white ring remained in her pocket, but its meaning shifted. It was no longer a desperate talisman against a specific threat, but a quiet reminder of the love that had been, a connection that transcended presence and absence. Her focus shifted to Jacob. Her son was growing, his questions about his father becoming more frequent. She realized she could not let him grow up with the story of a father who had simply disappeared, a story of loss and abandonment. She had to give him the legacy. One evening, as she tucked him into his pallet, Jacob asked the question she had been dreading. "Is Papa ever coming home?" Sarah sat beside him, the flickering lamplight casting soft shadows on his small, curious face. She took a deep breath and began to tell him the story. But it was not the story of a man who had run away. It was the story of a man who was brave. "Your father was a man of great strength, Jacob," she began, her voice soft but sure. "He was smarter and stronger than anyone knew. He believed that a man's spirit was a fire that no one had the right to put out. He looked at the world and saw that it was wrong, and he decided to make it right in the only way he could." She did not speak of chains or whips. She spoke of courage and defiance. She told him his father had gone on a long journey, a journey to find a place where he could stand up tall and be the man he was meant to be. She was no longer just the keeper of his memory, she was the author of his legacy, shaping the story of Tobias Green not as one of loss, but as one of enduring, triumphant courage. Of all the people on the Vance plantation, Elias Vance was the only one who remained largely unchanged by the entire affair. For him, the drama had reached its conclusion. The hunt had failed, the asset was lost. He had already taken the necessary steps to correct the entry in his ledger. A new blacksmith, a younger, less skilled man purchased at a discount from a trader in Savannah, now worked at the forge. The rhythmic clang of this new hammer was a sound of business as usual, a sound that soothed Vance's irritation. The entire episode was now relegated to a settled financial loss, an annoying but ultimately manageable disruption. He sat in his study, a ledger open before him, the columns of numbers neat and orderly. He was annoyed certainly by the lingering superstitions among his slaves, by the way they still sometimes fell silent when he approached, by the almost holy reverence they seemed to grant the great oak. It was inefficient, this emotional residue. It was a variable he could not control or quantify. But as long as the cotton was picked, the fields were tilled, and the profits continued to flow, he did not truly care. He heard the new blacksmith's hammer ringing in the distance and made a neat, precise entry in his book. The human cost, the shattered lives, the birth of a legend, the psychological torment of his own overseer, none of it registered. It was all just noise, a faint and distant hum beyond the solid, reassuring reality of his profit and loss. His cold, profound detachment, his inability to see the people he owned as anything more than figures in a book, was perhaps the most chilling indictment of the entire system, a system that rotted the soul not only of the oppressed but of the oppressor as well. The years fell away like autumn leaves, piling one on top of the other until nearly 3 decades had passed. The world that had forged Tobias Green in fire and bondage was itself broken and remade. The war had come and gone, a great and terrible storm that had swept across the land, leaving silence in its wake. The day of Jubilee had arrived, not as a whisper of hope in the dark, but as a proclamation read in the open air, a word that was itself a key turning a lock. The Vance plantation, once a meticulously managed engine of profit and human suffering, was now a ruin. Kudzu, the vine that eats the south, had swallowed the outbuildings whole, its thick green blanket covering the skeletons of barns and sheds. The master's house was a collapsed wreck, its proud white columns fallen and broken, its roof caved in like a skull crushed under a great weight. Elias Vance was long dead, buried in a family plot that was now as overgrown and forgotten as his legacy. His wife and children had fled north after the war, their wealth turned to ash, their name a fading whisper in the county. The land was quiet, returning to the wild, untamed state it had known before the first furrow was ever plowed. In the late 1860s, when the air was crisp with the promise of autumn, 2 figures walked the overgrown road leading back to that forgotten place. It was an elderly Sarah, her hair a crown of silver, her face a beautiful map of the years she had endured. Her back was stooped, but her eyes were clear and bright. Beside her walked her son Jacob, a tall, strong man in his early 30s, his shoulders broad, his hands capable. He was a free man, born into bondage but raised in the light of his mother's resilient hope. And now he walked the earth with the easy confidence of a man who owned his own steps. For Sarah, this journey was a pilgrimage, a final closing of a circle that had remained open for a lifetime. As they walked, she reflected on the decades that had passed, the immense and almost unimaginable changes she had witnessed. She had survived the terror of Croft and the cold dread of Finch. She had lived through the war, hearing the distant thunder of cannons and praying for the dawn that was promised. She had held her son's hand on the day the news of emancipation came, a joy so vast and overwhelming it had felt like a physical pain in her chest. Freedom, once a concept as distant and abstract as a star, was now the simple ground beneath her feet, the air in her lungs. And beside her, Jacob, her free-born son, was the living, breathing proof of it all, the ultimate fulfillment of the promise his father had made to himself in the dead of night. The promise that a man must find his own shade. They found it easily. It was the only thing that had truly endured. The great oak tree stood at the center of the ruin, larger and more majestic than Sarah had ever remembered. Its branches, thick as a man's body, reached for the sky, its leaves a canopy of deep, vibrant green. It had outlasted the house, the barns, the master, the overseer, and the entire system that had played out its brutal drama beneath its boughs. It was a silent, living monument to survival. Sarah and Jacob stopped beneath it, the air cool and still in its immense shadow. The outbuildings were gone. The forge where Tobias had shaped iron and rebellion was a mere ghost of a foundation. But the tree stood. Jacob, who had only known the tree through his mother's stories, looked up in awe, his eyes tracing the powerful spread of its limbs. Sarah, however, looked at one branch in particular, the lowest, thickest one, the one that had served as a gallows for a set of chains for a few short hours. She stepped closer, her aged hand reaching out to touch the rough, gnarled bark. Her fingers, thin and wrinkled, traced the contours of the wood until they found it, a smooth, slightly indented patch on the underside of the branch. It was a scar, healed over by decades of growth, but still there, a subtle, permanent mark where the heavy iron had bitten into the living wood. It was the only physical evidence that remained of that fateful morning, a small, secret testament that it had all been real. She closed her eyes, feeling the texture of the scar under her fingertips, and for a moment she could almost hear it, the faint, ghostly clinking of a chain swinging in the morning breeze. As they stood there in the quiet reverence of the moment, a sound drifted from the road, the gentle creak of wagon wheels and the soft murmur of voices. A family was passing by, a man and a woman with their 2 young children, all strangers. Their faces filled with the hope of a new life in a new world. They were freedmen, their clothes simple but neat, their posture proud. As they drew level with the great oak, the father slowed their mule and pointed a finger toward the tree. Sarah and Jacob, standing half hidden in the deep shade, fell silent and listened. "You see that tree, children?" The man's voice carried on the clear air, a voice full of warmth and a teacher's patience. "That's the Tobias tree. They say, a long, long time ago, when this was a dark place, there was a man who vanished from right here. A blacksmith. One morning everyone woke up and he was gone. But he left his chains, the very chains that were meant to bind him, hanging from that branch right there." He pointed to the exact branch Sarah had just been touching. "He left them hanging as a promise that we'd all be free one day." The children stared at the tree, their eyes wide with wonder. The legend had outlived the plantation. It had outlived the master and the overseer. It had survived the war and had been passed down, a foundational story of hope for a new generation that had never felt the lash or the shackle. It was no longer a story of a single man's escape, but a prophecy that had been fulfilled. A profound and final peace settled over Sarah. She let her hand fall from the bark of the tree. In that moment, hearing the story on the lips of a stranger, a story that had grown so much larger than her own personal grief, she felt the last of her questions fall away. It no longer mattered what had truly happened to Tobias. It did not matter if he had made it to the north, if he had lived a long life as a free man, or if he had perished in the wilderness, his body returning to the earth. She understood now that his true destination had never been a place on a map. His victory was not in arriving, but in leaving. He had not just escaped his bondage, he had transformed himself into a symbol, an idea of freedom that could never be captured, never be chained, never be killed. He had become a story, and the story had done its work. It had planted a seed of hope that had blossomed for generations. She turned her gaze from the tree to her son. Jacob stood tall and straight, his face thoughtful as he watched the family continue down the road. He was the harvest of that seed. He was the promise fulfilled. A deep, peaceful smile bloomed on Sarah's face, a smile free of sorrow, free of longing, free of the uncertainty that had haunted her for so long. The mystery of Tobias Green remained, a ghost of a question hanging in the Georgia air. But for Sarah, his story was finally beautifully complete.